Okay, so to everyone that's here, hello and welcome once again to another one of the IGDA workshops that we have been organizing. So today we have Ekman, who is the current UX Research Director at Embark Studios, and previously she was with DICE as the UX Research Manager, and she's going to talk through a little bit about how she does user research and what are the important things to look out for and how to plan user research. Okay, so I'm going to hand you over to Inge, and maybe you can give a little bit more intro about yourself as well.
I will do. So let's start sharing first, please. Can you confirm that you can see this? Perfect. So today, I'm really excited about being here, being able to talk about playtesting. The past year or two has been particularly challenging when it comes to playtesting and actually doing it in practice. But I thought about what I wanted to talk about here today, and rather than sit down and do a hands-on, let's learn how to ask open-ended questions, I wanted to go back a little bit and think about all the things that have really had an impact on the value my work has been able to bring to teams. So just a little bit about myself. Like Vivian mentioned, my name is Inger Ekman. At this point, I've worked with games research for 20 years or so, partially through academic research and partially on the side of industry. Currently, I'm at Embark Studios. It's a Stockholm-based, fairly new studio, and I'm involved in overseeing the way we leverage player research throughout the development on some new super secret IP projects. And in my past, I've had the fortune of working at EA with games across the EA portfolio, and before that, also in academia on some experimental games research. So I've used a wide variety of different kinds of methods, and the bottom line is, doesn't really matter what method you use. What you need to take care of as you're playtesting is you need to figure out how research integrates into the development process, because otherwise research doesn't matter. So it's been a journey and into ways of using player feedback, how it's been helping teams at different stages, and how research benefits design. And I thought, rather than leave, why not share some of the mistakes and some of the pet peeves that I've had throughout these years, and see if you can make smarter decisions than I did. So for today, I'm going to be talking a little bit, giving more of a justification of actually why do we playtest? Why do we need to push for more meaningful playtesting? And I do love a conversation, so please, as we're going, if you want to post questions and write them out, if I can react to them, I will try and answer them ongoing, but at least then we have a log that we can get back to at the end of the session. And in the end, I promised you hands-on, so I'm going to be sharing my personal favorite for how to run user research and playtesting. But it's only going to be one single method, but I do feel like it's a really, really effective way of tackling some of the difficult puzzles we run into with games user research. So with that, let's get started. I want to start at this very basic question: what is game experience? And more specifically, let's realize that game causes experience. Experience is the outcome. It is not built into the code. It happens when you combine the game that you have been spending time building and creating, sweating, crunching, working with players. And what that means is, as you're adding the player, the player is the one having the experience. This means that the experience is an entirely subjective thing. And how that experience is interpreted depends entirely on qualities that the player brings to the situation, such as their attitudes, such as their preferences, and such as their expectations. So this means that there is no objective player experience with your game. It's more like a waffle that you add water and then it becomes waffles, but you don't really have the experience unless you add the player first. And the second perspective, of course, is that the experience unfolds as the result of the active engagement with the game, which means that if a player buys your game but never really boots it up, that player is not having the game experience, even if they purchase the product. It also means that the player has to be successful doing something in order to unlock the experience you've hidden there. They have to make choices, and that also includes all the capabilities and the competence and the skills the player brings to the table. Now, this might seem really basic, but this is a huge thing. It means that the game as a product that is the focus of development, that is what pays our salaries, is not really the thing that the player enjoys. Instead, the game experience is something that they co-create based on the thing we push out. So to make it very specific, the reason we need to involve players throughout the development process is because the thing we're selling, the thing that's actually or sharing or making available, engaging players with, doesn't exist without them. So our only way of seeing it, only way of understanding what the product is by involving players in the process. Now, of course, what bridges the gap between the two is what players do with the product. And this is obviously shaped by the game. It's objectively observable and the experience arises from that interaction. So it's not blind development. But I think this is a really critical thing to realize, that we're talking about a product that derives its value after it's basically left our hands. And let me see if I can actually, there we go. This shift is not unique to games. It's something that's being talked about a lot right now because it's been happening across multiple industries over the last 10 to 20 years, as more and more focus is shifting over from making things, physical things, goods, to instead building services and products that are essentially experiential and ephemeral. And this model over here, this is Nielsen's corporate UX maturity model, which talks about the radical changes that organizations go through as they progress through these different sequences of transitioning from one mindset of thinking into another one. This is not a quick thing. This is not the button you can press. This is a multi-year process of changing organizations from the inside. And you know, if we start on the lowest tiers of this, where you know, where the user is irrelevant because the product speaks for itself, there can be quite the mindset shift and quite of a battle going on to get people to leave that space. Once you're on this path, once you're realizing that players actually mean a lot, and players are central to your development decisions that you're making, there's still a lot of things that need to happen in a company to enable proper player research or user-centric research or playtesting. All that matters. You need skill, you need staff, you need lab equipment, you need money, you need budgets for setting up expensive research equipment. And roughly, Nielsen estimates that organizations that take the full route of going through this process reach the highest year if they go full speed on in 20 years. So we're in the middle of this huge transformation, and games are leading part of that transformation because we are building products that are essentially nothing else but experiences. It's sometimes a harder sell for companies that have something else, a utility value, a reason for people to engage with their product. With games, there is no other reason than you do it for the enjoyment of it. So we're able to lead this change as well from within the games industry. And that is what is happening with playtesting. Oh, there was animation. Wow. I thought I stripped it off. Let's move onwards. So if you think about then the role of someone who's organizing playtesting, and this is essentially all of you, if you're going to take what we talk about today and start running with it, is being part of shaping these UX mature organizations. It's about how you prioritize player experiences inside of the organization. Now, what does that bring for a company? Well, first of all, playtesting keeps focus on the experience. It keeps reminding everyone that this is what matters. This is what we make. This is why we're making it. It sparks player empathy. It keeps everyone thinking of the player, and oftentimes also gives people a sense of purpose to the work they're doing. I know I work in games industry because I really love the ability to touch people's lives through games. There's so much joy. There's so much healthy fun that you can derive from games, and there's so much value in the creation, the relationships people are creating over games, and it's humbling to be able to work with these experiences. It's also good to have playtesting to provide that fresh perspective. It's easy to get lost in a project over longer times, and to keep the mind on that player outcome is really morale building, can keep teams surviving hardships. Playtesting is also your way of building a feedback culture, and not just the feedback from players. It's about the feedback you provide on each other's work inside of the company, being able to separate yourself from what you're building, being able to provide very constructive criticism. All of that is core to a healthy organization, and playtesting is really in there in the depths creating it. Identifying blind spot, obviously, when we're building an experience, being able to notice any aspects of the experience that you haven't taken into account. And playtesting tends to be one of the first roles that pokes its noses into things that haven't been done before, and tends to identify, if there is a missed out role or missed out capability, you tend to notice it when you try to put a build in front of players. Building code, games, software, assets, features is a lot of work, and sometimes just by merit of how much work that is, you tend to start losing touch on how value is created with players. So playtesting is always there as a reminder of sometimes your value comes through a health bar. Sometimes you can add a lot of value through very, very, very tiny little changes. And other times you're going through massive changes and you can't really get the experience to move. And that is a sobering thing to think about when we're also thinking about how to continue evolving this industry, because obviously putting a lot of effort into things that don't really resonate with players is not great business. Finally, risk management obviously comes from knowing the blockers early and avoiding surprises. But there's a side benefit to playtesting, which comes through the development hygiene. If you regularly playtest, it forces you to keep your project in a tidy space. It forces you to keep your builds playable. It forces you to have project-wide alignment on what is in the game, where are we right now? And that is a huge benefit for keeping developments on track. So with this long list of things, I guess it's not a hard sell. I mean, I don't think I've ever met a single game team that doesn't believe in playtesting or doesn't believe it's worth it. But if you're thinking of playtesting as a final thumbs up, at the end of the product, you're missing out on a lot of value. And it's really that pulling that playtesting activity earlier in the product and process that can sometimes be a little bit difficult. And then it's when you start doing it, when you run into some murky waters. So I want to do some constructive myth-busting here and tackle some of the obstacles. And maybe you can go like, yes, I've heard that, if you have encountered the same myths that I've been tackling as I've gone through my career. First one comes here. Can we just test if it's fun? No one's writing anything. That makes me so happy to hear, because this is a cop-out. If you do not know what your design is intended to do more than be fun, research won't help you. There are no metric silver bullets to get you value out of playtesting if you just toss something out there and want to see how it performs. And getting value out of playtesting requires that we do some upfront work before we start testing, elaborating the design intent on a far deeper level than that. Let's take an example. Looking for fun oversimplifies the question. Let's talk about dating. If you were to evaluate a relationship based on the same loose metrics of is it fun, you know, the first Tinder date or the first random encounter, the qualities that get you into a second date are not the same ones that keep you in a long-lasting relationship. So why should it be for games? Fun is just not a good indicator of what the game is going to do for the player, why they're choosing to continue or leave the game, or even if the player says the game is fun, is that even coming from the same sources of that experience? So just as with relationships, when players are engaging with games, they're going through different kinds of evaluation processes. And in the beginning, it's all about first impressions. Everything is new, everything, there's not a lot of history to color those experiences. And players are sensitive to rumors, they're sensitive to hearsay, and there's a huge risk for misinterpretations. Maybe they thought this was a different game, and that's why they got into it. There's very little patience also with mistakes and frustration. Players are super quick to leave. Now, once you overcome that part, players are in the dating space where they're building a relationship with the game. Experiences are now tempered with expectations, but it's a weighing calculation. You know, is this the game for me? There's a willingness to try new things still. You might go out golfing while you're dating, even if you've never golfed before. And there's a tolerance for mistakes that comes in relation, in weighed relation. As you have positive encounters, you're willing to tolerate a little bit more. But there's still a curiosity, a novelty to it all that kind of adds a little bit of a rose tint to everything you do. And it's not going to last. When players have stuck with the game for a longer time, they are now committed, they are now playing that game, maybe they identify themselves as players of that game. There's a different sense of belonging. Evaluation is now based solely on experience, history together, and there's a regular commitment, but it's also important that that regular commitment fits your life. So when you can see players spending copious amounts of extra time playing games as they go through the beginning, at some point they need to find a good balance where the game fits in with their life, has to fit in with their friends, it has to fit in with all the other things they want to see. And players come now to the product for the experiences that only this game delivers. So they have a deep relationship with this specific flavor of fun. Patience grows the longer you go. If you're on a plus side, you're basically putting trust into a piggy bank. And as long as you can keep that, the tolerance for mistakes is pretty high until the relationship, if the relationship starts consuming that over long term, and then you can kind of go on a minus side again. Another table here. Another reason for why that happens is because the reason for what change causes fun changes over time. And you need to have the right components in place to keep the flame alive. A better indicator of continued engagement is player motivational satisfaction. And this is really what this graph is all about. If we want to have long-lasting relationships, we need to get away from the things that are fleeting and quick, and we need to start identifying the things that power those emotions. So mostly for you as a home exercise, a little thing to think about. What are the things you enjoy when you get into a game versus the ones that cause you to stay with it? And if you think about the things that you've enjoyed playing for years and years and years, can you identify what those are? So I said, let's not test fun. I'm going to give you some alternatives to testing fun. More constructive things are to test the things that enable fun. The comprehension and clarity is a really important thing. It's about understanding goals, what players should be doing, the means to achieve different goals in the game, and understanding and resonating with the rewards. Do players see a point of doing the thing the game is asking them to? Player capability is another thing that players are bringing into the game. That's one of the attributes they bring, is how successfully they are able to interact with the game. And so let's track that and let's work on that. What is the player's sense of accomplishment? And mind you, games are almost always more complex than developers think they are. There are no development teams on this earth that don't get used to their game and have trouble sitting in the shoes of a first-time user, understanding the struggle they're going through as they're trying to understand the game. So adapting the game to players with different expectations and skill levels, a lot more productive than testing for fun. And then the last one is playability and usability. Even if you're not actively working on fun, what you can do always is start removing those friction points and the frustration that are basically antithesis to fun. So these are already a lot more actionable than trying to measure fun. So just to sum it up, can we test if the game is fun? No. You should not. You should never resort to doing a cheap thing like that. Try to break down the question into more specific hypotheses though, and you have something really powerful, because now you're not just testing whether your game has it, you're also very eloquently describing exactly why your game is unique. There are no metric silver bullets, and lasting engagement depends on more than fun. So we shouldn't be spending too much time thinking about it. Here's another one. I should always test with external players. It sounds really, really agreeable, right? That's why we're here. And famous UX influencing voice of reason, Arne Lund, says, you are not the user. Certainly we're not. But let's talk a little bit about what kind of feedback we're looking for the games. We're talking about experiences where sometimes you're trying to capture how the game feels after hundreds and hundreds of hours of play. You're trying to get players into deep, complex systems. There's very, very, very little that a new player can do in the lab to give you answers on these questions. So you absolutely need to start thinking about the palette of testing more broadly than just bringing in external players. External players are crucial, but you absolutely also need to look at the different components you can bring in also from internal testing. So let's look at a little bit of a breakdown here. Developers versus players, what makes them different? What makes them similar? Well, developers are most often expert players. They are experts at the game they are making because they're probably building and testing it every single day. They're also more likely to be core gamer. It is quite a bit of a commitment to decide to work in the game industry. That's already showing that you are more interested in games than the average person. Developers also have a view into the game and a view into making games that allows them to root cause some issues a lot more efficiently and a lot more faster and more accurately than players. And they also will be able to talk about how to fix issues. But no, they're not typical players. They know the game far too well to be able to answer many of the kind of questions that you would be answering through playtesting, which would be things like new user experience. And they have a personal investment into the products, which can sometimes be a little bit difficult to decouple. Well, players, on the other hand, external players here, are definitely the intended audience, and you can be very selective about who you bring in as well. This is not something you can do with developers. If you want specific people testing, you might not have enough of them in your studio, but with external players, you can target the kind of capabilities or the kind of attitudes and competencies you want to look at the game through. They also have no personal investment in the studio. Sometimes they do. That's very important to control for, but generally you should try and aspire for them not having a personal investment, because that makes it a more neutral evaluation point. On the challenges side, players might be talking in the same language as you, but they don't necessarily always mean the same things. So when a external player talks about matchmaking, it might not translate directly one-on-one onto how you think about matchmaking internally. So you need to be a little bit cautious about how you're interpreting the feedback you're getting. Their responses are also not always as actionable, because they might be commenting on things that are very surface level symptoms of a far deeper root cause. So it takes a little bit of working to root cause why their comments are coming through. And definitely more logistics is involved in bringing in external players around legal questions, around where you bring them in, around scheduling, timing, all of that. But don't dismiss the fact that you have resources in both ends, and internal developers can be a really good source as well for playtesting. In fact, I would recommend that when possible, you run sessions as double sessions, where you add a little bit more rigor on your internal testing as well. Comparisons give a really good way to contextualize data. So a developer who has been part of a playtest and then receives external feedback that is shaped the same way as they were involved is going to be able to understand the feedback in a different way. And just as an example, 3.4 as a data number doesn't really mean anything. But when you have that sense of gut feel of what you have played internally and how your internal evaluations landed, now you have a reference point that you can understand the external playtesting feedback with as well. It becomes also very clear that there are no silver bullets. So the more you run data internally inside of the studio, the more educated people will be, the more follow-up questions they will have about the results, and the less misinterpretations and knee-jerk reactions there will be to the data that you might be collecting. So motivations, great thing. Is there actually a super fantastic way to determine which players are relevant to test your game as well? So as you're doing the work of defining what fun means for your game, you can use that same map then to also determine who would be the players who you want to hear from. If you have a flavor of fun that is really critical to your game, then you should make sure that you're inviting players who typically like and enjoy those kinds of activities. And screening based on behaviors is really effective, because when you can talk about motivations, you can identify games, competitors that have done the same things, and you can start asking players, have you played this game? Did you enjoy it? How long have you spent with this experience? And you get a good metric of whether they are the kind of player who would also like to play your game. This gives you a high sense of confidence in the data you're getting from them. Far better than just working around fun. Let's push it even further. Do we need players at all? And sometimes the answer is no, we don't. A designer who has worked in the industry for a longer time will have a bunch of best practices up their sleeve. And if you pull your sources together, and if you start defining what fun means and what you want to achieve with the product, most likely you can come up with a bunch of guidelines or rule sets. Or if you don't, you can tap into the existing ones that are out there for you to grab. There's guidelines on usability, there's best practices on accessibility, there's a ton of different heuristics that you can tap into as part of your development. And what do they do? Well, they're basically best practices on steroids. It's a quick, easy way for you to check, have you sanity check your design? Have you covered the basic parts, the basic requirements that would prevent the player from, for instance, finding that your game is usable? And are there some low-hanging fruits for you to address before you go into the effort of inviting external players? This is also a pretty decent thing just to do with players. When we invite external players, we don't want to treat them like they're there to find those low-hanging fruits. We want to really treat them to an experience that we believe in, because that's where their feedback starts mattering the most. So, should you always test with external players? Well, no. But once you have an experience you believe in yourself, you absolutely need to start bringing in external eyes as well, because you will be missing things if you're just playing it internally. All right. Playtesting equals events. This is just about tackling the over-focus on the events themselves. This is about describing playtesting processes as planning a session, running a session, compiling the results of a session. And what that is missing is why we playtest. It misses the whole function of what that insight is being used for. I love this graph. It's such a simple, easy graph called the UX double diamond, and it describes a scenario that never happens anywhere when you're designing UX, but it idealizes the process of being able to define what you intend to build as the first step of the process. And then as you decided what you want to go for, going over into the second phase, which is how you build that thing. Now, I said it never happens. We'll get to that in a little bit, but let's first talk about the different research or the different player insights we have in these different phases. When you're figuring out what you want to design, you're going to be doing all kinds of research, explorations, discovery to figure out what different possible experiences are there, and to select and pick the ones that work for you and that you want to go for. So it's a process of discovery and focus. And how playtesting helps here is if you get player insight, you are able to both validate some assumptions on what you think players do and care about, and also make sure that as you're defining what you want to build, you're defining the critical things that will matter to players. And maybe you're kind of omitting some aspects that aren't as important. They're not hard locked there. In the second phase of this, it's about designing things right. And this is where playtesting lives. It's about experimenting, testing potential solutions, putting them out there, looking at how they fare. And then in the very end of the process, polishing, iterating, just making sure that everything is right on spot with the product. I seem to be, let's see, there we go. Sorry about that. If we look at the double diamond and the activities that happen throughout that process, roughly we can see 3 types of studies by the purpose and use case there. The explorative research is research that seeks new understanding. It's about describing what players do, understanding how experiences arise with the product, understanding how changes to the game affect experience. If I pull this lever, what happens then? But the goal is knowledge. The goal is not action directly. We might still be playtesting to get at this. The middle is the formative research. This is the research that is about improving and shaping the experience, seeking out and addressing UX issues, investigating known challenges, determining how to solve them, investigating intended experiences to figure out how the current experience differs from the intended and where it's broken. This is hypothesis driven. We think we'll do this, and or we are doing this, we think doing this will achieve that. And you're basically going into every session with a question: when we did this, did that happen? And the last one is summative research. And that's where, rather than going in with all of these, you're going in with goals. You're saying, we need to hit this. And you want to measure and see whether you are at a specific point. You're evaluating an outcome, or you're giving a success rate on quality or achievement. And determining whether we're meeting targets, whether we're at the key performance indicators we set out for ourselves. And what this requires is not a hypothesis, but a set of defined goals that you can then measure yourself against. Now, you might have noticed that formative research and summative research requires something in order to be able to deliver insights. And this is where the cop-out happens, because what you will see a lot of the "is this fun" formulated as is actually explorative research, because you don't go in with hypotheses, you don't go in with goals, you just go in with an open question mark. And it's okay, there is space for open question marks, but that space is relatively early in the product. Early, you want to ensure that you know the design space and foster that player empathy, understand the experiences, and ensure your vision is anchored in the details that matter to players. But later on, you should be exploring how to deliver on your vision. Your ID generation should state hypotheses on how to achieve intended experience. Your prototypes should be making those hypotheses testable, and your tests, your play testing, should be all about observing if the built experience matches the intended design. And I mentioned that the double diamond is an ideal, and this is what I like to call the trouble diamond. And this is where playtesting loses its power. Because if you go into a session and never really know what you're testing, if you go into a session and then you discover something, and that discovery might mean, well, we're going to have to change how it's built, or, well, maybe we have to change what we're building, or maybe we can just sit tight and let's see if it goes away, then you're essentially wasting efforts because you're not driving action with the research you're doing. And this is where a strong hypothesis matters the most, because it helps shield your game from design, also by public opinion. Because playtesting where, did my sound disappear? Okay. All right. Because if you're playtesting and you can take the feedback you're getting from players and you take it as an impetus to change your design, then who is owning the vision? And that is not a great place to be in for a game team, giving away their vision on what they want to shape to the community. So by making sure that you have those hypotheses, you can also create a much nicer environment for designers and for the team who feels like they have committed, they have fallen in love with the product and they want to deliver that product. And there is a shield around that product that says, okay, it's still not resonating with our players. We still have work left to do to show you exactly what this is, but we're doing this thing. And most importantly, it avoids doing research or it avoids doing playtesting for playtesting's sake. And I'm an old ex-academic. There's a lot of things you can know and there's a value for knowing them. But I would also say it's not within development to look at all the questions that are irrelevant for the product you're currently making. So to the question about playtesting equals events, no. We know the goals we want to support. We actually have to broaden the scope of what playtesting does. And playtesting has to be in there pushing for those questions and making sure that the results are actioned on and that there is a plan to action on results from playtesting. All right. Practical question. How many have you heard? How many has heard this? It's too early to test. It's not ready yet. We can't do it. This is the flip side of we want to serve our players right. And it's a necessary flip side to still treat with utmost severity, because our way of doing players right is bringing a really strong hypothesis in front of them. But if we're doing that very late in the product, then there's no way to listen to their feedback and do anything about it. So the earlier we start testing, the more impact and the more value players can actually have on the game, and the more they can be listened to. A little surprise to some, hopefully not to you in this room, is we don't need to have a Reddit game to test. If we look at game readiness, though, there's two critically different aspects of making the game readier that impact the feedback you can get from the product. The functional aspect of how a game works. Does it respond to user interaction? Does it offer meaningful choice? Are the parts of the system doing what they're intended to do? Is typically really, really critical to get in place in order to have good playtesting. It's also the less predictable aspect of development, because that's where the non-linearity of player behavior, player skill, player understanding comes in. So if you're thinking about the places in development where players can really create surprises, it is if you have pushed these functional, these deep systems very late before you start testing them. However, the look and feel part of a game is typically not something that is as heavily influenced by players. Sure, there's the subjective experience of enjoying and having, you know, the sensory fun of something looking amazing that is not there until it actually looks amazing. But it's not a surprise the same way as function. So when you're defining your research questions through hypotheses, it also becomes a lot easier to work with partially ready designs, because you can start pulling them apart a little bit, and you can start identifying the parts of the system that work as intended and the parts of the system that are still not finished. So try and find ways of bringing to players all kinds of prototypes in all different stages, and you'll be surprised as how easy it is. You can work with paper prototypes, and you can work with Wizard of Oz testing, where you are essentially the system, simulating the system for the user. So there's a lot of testing you can do super early to tackle those difficult functionalities before they have been properly built. And research at the mercy of a development plan can work if the company is really UX mature, but oftentimes research has to push the development plan a little bit. So don't let the existing plan dictate what you test. Look at what is critical, what is difficult to fix, what is expensive to build, what has lots of dependencies, or what is really difficult to grasp, and then try to find ways of testing those parts of the game as early as possible. So for prototyping, sometimes it's worth doing some wasted work in order to get a bespoke prototype in front of players. If you fulfill these 3 criteria, something's going to be difficult to build, it's going to be important to get right once it's done, and it's going to be frequently used by players. There's a point in dedicating extra resources to make this outside the engine in some format in order to get playtesting on it before you commit the kind of hard resources on coding it. And like I mentioned, prototypes can be anything that materializes the design intent. If it's you standing in for the system, showing images in the right order, paper prototyping, or low fidelity scenarios, mock screens, card sorts, as long as you can express how the system is supposed to work, you can start testing it. And then once you have a little bit more done, you have clickable prototypes, or maybe you have white box levels, amazing, you can do everything with those. And it doesn't matter if the experience is kind of half there, because you can still step in and fill in for the bits that the system isn't doing. So for instance, you lack onboarding. Well, now the researcher is your first time user experience, and they will onboard you into the game so that you can start playing it. So it's never too early to test. But the biggest blocker to early testing is if you have that trouble diamond going on and you are building already without clear design intent, then that is really difficult to test. So before I share my favorite method with you, quick recap. We've gone over the benefits of playtesting, and we've talked about the importance of testing for something else than fun. We've talked about the problem sorry, I'm losing my... We've talked about the integration of playtesting deep into the quality process, talked about how it can become a part of driving user-centric behaviors across the company. And of how to push for ability to research throughout development. And theoretically, if you have all of that, then what you have achieved is you have defined your hypothesis, you have considered what players you want the input from, you have considered what specific parts of the games you want to test. And this is essentially all you need in order to determine what data you need to gather from players. So going from the intended actions and what kind of impact you want to drive with research is going to make the process of designing a playtest so much simpler. Because what you can start looking at here is, what do you need data on? Do you need data on what people are doing, what they are achieving, what they are able to complete in the game? Or do you want to understand how they feel about it, what they say about it, how those experiences are resonating against those motivations? On the action side, in order to action, do you need to know how much, how frequently, how often? Or do you need to know why, how come, what kind? Once you know the actions you want to drive, it's fairly straightforward to sit down. Do you want usability issues because you're going to fix everything you find? Don't need numbers. You can go in with a very qualitative approach and just list every single issue you come against. Heuristics do that. Usability sessions do that, but they give you that how much as well. Do you only need the how much? You can go in with a survey, you can go in with quantitative metrics, you can maybe even track it through telemetry to see what's happening. Most often though, what you want to do is you want to combine multiple methods until you have the package that suits your needs. So you probably want to go in and find issues, but also set them in some sort of priority order. Well, then you need to combine methods from both sides. This is like a smorgasbord for you to pick the things you need for sessions. And then comes the viability of the studies. And this is where I'm going to share my absolute favorite. This is a fantastic method when it's a bit unclear how to move forward. So you're facing some sort of problem solving, but you're also suspecting that you might have some unknowns in the way. So you don't want to go full closed. You want to still have the door open for maybe we discover something new as we go on. We can observe behaviors, but we don't really know if they're good or bad. That's also a thing where we have something that's happening on and we're like, something's going on here. Or you have an issue on sentiment level. People aren't liking the game as it is, but surveys kind of don't show anything. The issue seems to fly a little bit under the radar, suggesting that players aren't, maybe they're not great at self-reporting, or maybe you're just not hitting the topic as you're trying to ask about it. There's a lot of murky situations where this method works super well. So again, if we look at the space of kind of where you want to go, you kind of want to look at the behavioral, but you also want to collect something from the attitudinal, and you definitely want to be able to go deep into that qualitative space to understand the how. Numbers in this case aren't that important. And let me see why I can't. And the method I want to share with you is assisted recall, think aloud. So this is where you take a handful of players, you let them first play without interruptions, but then you do a separate session to follow up with them. So you have them think aloud and you go over the experience with them in detail. How you are able to do that is because you're recording everything that they're doing. So you can sit down and rewatch a screen cap of what they're doing. This is a great way of accessing really tough to access situations. So say, for instance, you have a game which is cognitively really demanding, or you have a multiplayer session where players are constantly communicating with other players. And if you as a researcher were to go into that situation, you would change the situation. So you need to be very hands-off during the gameplay, but you still want to understand what's happening. It's hard to explain how remarkably a screen recording can help jog people's memories. I've literally sat in sessions where at the beginning of the session we discussed the experience and the player said, yeah, I don't really recall ever playing that. And then as you start rolling the tapes, they can speak about specific menu choices they have made, or specific waymarks they've seen on the map that made them go in some direction. It's hard, unless you know how the human memory works, to understand how much hidden memory there is that you can get moving with showing a video like that. So where is this great? It's great for understanding the onboarding needs or the first experiences with a product. It's great for problem solving deep, hairy design issues, or like I said, to access hard to access play experiences. And what more? During this last year, it's also proven that it's a fantastically easy or convenient method to get working over remote connections. So it means that you can work with players who are not located in the same region where you are, if possible, given again what you're playtesting, but maybe if the build can be with them so that they can have free access to the game, they can run the session whenever they want, the first play session, and just record their experience at home, and you can approach it almost like a diary study. It's a light lab structure, so it means that there's no expensive equipment or things like that that are standing in the way of you using this to do the research immediately. And the last part is, and this is so great, is the feedback you're collecting with players, because it's a talk aloud, think aloud over a video. If you record that, that is such a consumable format for feedback for development teams or stakeholders to also consume. It's almost self-explanatory if you want to just have that first instant view of the data. Of course, there's a lot of analysis that goes into kind of making sense of it and bringing it up. So as an example, we ran this thing earlier as a group playtest, had a 1 hour of gameplay, and this is just to give you roughly ideas of how much time you should be planning. If you have 1 hour of gameplay, you absolutely need to have 1.5, maybe even 2 hours to go over videos. If you're looking at the whole videos, you should have double the amount of time in the one-on-one sessions versus the actual play sessions. We did the one-on-one interviews with observations. They were also recorded, and then as we were going over those experiences, we time tagged all the observational data along with the commentary from players. The data analysis was all about what made challenges fun, when did the game feel unfair. We tried to look at different difficulty levels and different pushing kind of the buttons of players, and this was a great way of going into the depth of, you know, some of the small things that are adding challenge that players wouldn't be able to talk about because there was an elephant in the room as well during that. The tech we used for it, Discord, fantastic platform for running research on. You can have multi-stream, you can watch groups play as they go, and then just Google stuff. Google Sheets, surveys, meets. So it's such a easy and accessible way of running studies. I will park there for questions. I don't think I saw a lot of them coming through during, so excited to hear what you want to hear about.
So while we wait to see if anybody else has questions, I think I do have a question for you, which is, how do you, because I think most people in this presentation have an idea that UX is important, doing the user research is important, and it needs to happen early, especially after what you've talked about. I think they get the idea that it needs to start early. So if you are not in a position where you can actually say, just go, okay, we need to do the test now, how do you then convince someone else, like the project manager or your boss? If, for example, you're a programmer, so it's kind of none of your business in terms of studio structure wise, most of the time, it won't be anything that you have anything to do with. Or if you're a newcomer, an intern or a junior.
It's a great question. And I am answering from the comfort of a studio which is so open to feedback that I must be very spoiled, because what we do at Embark is anyone could just sit down with a colleague and start basically running this mini guerrilla testing. And I think that is I think that's a really desirable state, where research isn't a thing that is done by researchers. It's not a thing that lives in an ivory tower. Research is an activity, or playtesting is an activity that everyone is involved with. I feel like there's been some really effective branding to make research feel like a very exclusive activity that you need to have a PhD or something to do. And yes, some of the deeper research, if you want to go into quantitative analysis and statistics and all of that, don't use numbers unless you know how to use them. But can you sit down and observe players and pay attention to their behaviors and pay attention to what they're talking about without a researcher education? Hell yes. And that is something that I would love to see everyone involved with. So if you are in a company where you see a need for user testing, if you have a researcher in the company, I would just approach them and say, hey, can you mentor me? Can you help me do this and try out something small? Google did this amazing thing where they worked with a whole team of engineers and basically gave all the engineers a research training. The goal was not to create researchers out of them. The goal was to just raise the data literacy of that team. And I think that is a fantastic way forward, especially if the call comes, from someone else coming to me saying, hey, can you help me do research? That would be like Christmas for me.
So, because I also know there's a lot of students in this presentation as well, do you have any recommendations on readings that they could possibly look into, or other resources like podcasts and such?
Oh, there's so many. I think maybe we can work offline to compile a list that we can share. There are both fantastic books, fantastic podcasts, and but I would start just with looking into UX design, because UX design is about manipulating a lot of the solutions, and if you know the solutions, kind of why they make sense, and you start paying attention to the trouble that people run into. But let's work on that list separately.
Yep. Victor, would you like to jump on the call to ask a question?
Sure. Thanks for letting me in here. Yeah, my question is kind of simple. If a game development studio focus on quantity rather than quality, and they are like learning in the quantities of what is played or not, how could you as a game UX designer become a part of that studio? How could you make your UX work worth something for them?
I'm reading between the lines that you're referring to mobile, and mobile is very data driven, specifically in numbers. And it's the reason that it is possible, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason it is possible is that the designs are usually, not to say it's not like they're simple, but they're smaller, and it's easier to look at if you tweak a specific part of the experience to see that the overall metrics change. They also work with a very different user base, which just gives you a lot of numbers in a more convenient fashion that most of PC console gaming doesn't. work as frequently with as big numbers. So I think it's mostly of a convenience aspect, because you have the data and you don't have to actively interact with players to get their feedback. However, you will see these companies work with user research as well when they have questions that they can't tell, like why, or when they run out of hypotheses. So I mean that the value for UX research is definitely strongest in answering why or how or problem solving. It's not in numbers, and it's easy to abuse because you can present numbers from UX research as well, but the real value comes from sitting down with players and understanding a lot more about the nuance of how they're reasoning with the product. So I guess I would say, like, how do you break in that? Prove your point, find a problem that isn't easily trackable by data, and show it, and show how you can bring a solution to the table.
All right, I will do my detective work.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Let's see here. Do I think that there's a need for balanced internal external research relative to the scale of the team or studio? I absolutely think that if you have a big team, you have a benefit in tapping into internal, both because you will have a big team and some will be very central to the design. They will know all the details about it, and some will be working farther away from design. So they are going to be more fringe to knowing all the details, which gives them a slightly, it's like a semi-external participant where they're not fully briefed on you know what is happening. So if you have that, or if you have a studio with multiple teams and some are working on one project and others are on the other, then you can tap into those external developers almost like a source of external feedback. If you are 4 to 5 people, I mean, who's not going to know exactly what's happening in the game? And that changes the situation a bit, and it kind of forces you to work more with external people. I would ideally see small studios getting together and you know, tapping into each other, but I guess there's always the sensitivity of sharing the in development work.
So not sure if anyone else has any questions. I have one last question, however. So usually QA and user research is two completely separate departments. My personal view is that they should be combined to a certain extent when it comes to testing the games. But what do you have to say about that?
I think it differs a lot between between companies where user research is happening. Actually, user research in many cases also can originate from QA. So I think much of the early user research work that was being done in the game industry came either from within QA as a kind of extension of not just finding bugs, but finding problems, and problems can be, you know, elaborated into, okay, this is no longer fun, or it can be more kind of formulaic things where you can look at usability or accessibility, and cert practices, for instance, are a lot about that. And the other source, of course, is where it came from marketing, where marketing tries to understand, you know, what is this game and how is it going to be received. So I think the existence of UX research or research teams that are neither is a fantastic development, because it decouples research from some of the connotations between the different places. But I also see that if you decouple it entirely so that you actually have two teams that aren't talking, you're losing a lot. I could not do my work. I could not run effective research without a really strong relationship with the QA team and really strong support from there. But again, I could not run effective research without a lot of deep bonds all the way into the product. And this is where I think research has to live with the game team, and the game team has to care about these things. And that unlocks everything. There's a question here. Do I think there are games which would not benefit from external playtesting? I think it's not about the games, it's about why you build games. If you build a game because you are an artist expressing a vision, and this is your view on the game, and there's no expectations on others being able to play that game, why would you ever test it with others? If it's an expression of your design intent, then that's all. But is that a viable proposition in most industry jobs? It's not. So in the industry, if you're beholden to someone else to design a game, I don't think you often are given that choice. You have amazing questions.
Well, this is coming from a little bit of experience as well, so the questions from me would tend to come from a different direction. If there are no more questions, I guess we've run over time a little bit, so we'll let Inge go. I will be working with her to set up the reading lists and reference lists, so that, and I will post that in the IGDA Sweden Discord channel once we have that. Okay. Okay, so there is one last question from Eric. Does the scale or length of game testing differ between genres of games or different companies?
Let me think a little bit. So in between different game companies, definitely. And I think it's often a sign of UX maturity, is how early and how invested companies are with playtesting and research. So in that sense, there will be a difference. It's also a resourcing question. I think in terms of genres, the biggest shift that I'm seeing is with live games, because with games that are basically, you know, you develop them until a certain point, then you launch them, and then you're done with it. There is no point in following up with experiences after you've launched it. But with live games, the reality of players and how they're engaging with the product is very, very relevant to how you continue with the game. So there's definitely in the stages and where you're involved, and because different teams are involved at different times, it also shapes the kind of research. So for instance, when we started doing more live work at EA, there was an opportunity to work together with data science in a depth that wasn't there before. And I think that is really exciting when you have more teams working on insights. Currently, I'm working together with community management a lot to understand, you know, how do we want to foster a community that also feels like there's a way to feedback and your voice is heard. And that comes from the different genres or the different publishing formats you have.
Okay, so I guess that's it. So thank you, and hopefully we will see you again for a different workshop at some point. And I guess that's all for today. We have recorded this session, So once the edits and all that is done, and Inge has given the okay for us to post it, we will post this up so that you can go back and look through it again. Okay, that was a set of really wonderful slides and a lot of really good information. And I hope everyone has gotten a lot more than they thought they would from this session. I certainly did. So yeah, that is all. And IGDA Sweden will not be having more workshops for the rest of this year. It's going into the holidays, so we are taking a break. We will be planning more things for next year. One of the things is that we are definitely planning some major activity with IGDA Finland as well for the coming summer break. So fingers crossed pandemic doesn't screw up the plans again, but we are planning something big for the coming summer. Okay, so hopefully we'll see you there. Okay, all right. Thank you, Inge, and thank you, everyone. See ya.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.